Smoke rose into the night sky as the last Christian empire gasped its final breath. Behind bloodied walls and shattered dreams, the ancient city of Constantinople, once the proud heart of the Eastern Roman world, was dying. The sound of steel clashing and prayers screaming into the heavens blurred into a single moment, the moment history turned its back on 1,000 years of glory. But this wasn't just a war. It was betrayal. It was desperation. It was destiny. Once, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the eastern pillar of Rome's legacy, a glittering jewel between Europe and Asia. Its capital, Constantinople, rose proudly with golden domes and walls so thick they were said to defy death itself. But by the time the 15th century dawned, the empire that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean was a withered husk of its former power. The map no longer bore its reach from Egypt to Italy, nor did its treasury gleam with the gold of conquest. And what remained within its sacred walls was not unity, but rot. Long before the Ottomans launched a single cannonball, the Byzantine Empire had already begun to collapse from the inside. Greed had replaced vision. Rivalry had replaced faith. Emperors turned on emperors, brothers on brothers. Civil war became more frequent than peace. The Byzantine crown no longer passed through strength or leadership. It passed through deceit, bribery, and sometimes pure accident. In the name of power, generals burned towns loyal to other factions, cities starved while nobles feasted, and rival claimants poisoned each other's supporters in the shadows. Every internal fracture weakened the empire's spine, and each time it bent, it never quite stood upright again. One of the empire's gravest wounds came from a conflict it never truly recovered from, the Fourth Crusade. Instead of marching to liberate the Holy Land, the Crusaders turned their swords toward Constantinople itself in 1204, sacking it with terrifying violence. Churches were desecrated. Monasteries were looted. Priceless relics of Christendom vanished into the hands of Latin invaders. For 57 long years, the so-called Latin Empire sat like a foreign cancer inside Byzantine lands. Though the Byzantines eventually reclaimed their city in 1261, what returned was not the empire that once was. Constantinople was broken, its wealth pillaged, its people traumatized, and its strength shattered. The distrust between the Byzantines and the West deepened into an incurable poison. Despite sharing a common faith in Christianity, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church had severed ties in a dramatic schism back in 1054. While the split had theological roots, it carried dangerous political consequences. When the empire faced future threats, especially from the growing power of the Muslim Ottomans, it could no longer count on unified Christian support. Even pleas for military aid were met with suspicion and cynicism. Western kings saw a decaying empire not worth saving, and popes demanded the Byzantines first bow to Roman authority, something many in Constantinople saw as unthinkable humiliation. So the Byzantines stood increasingly alone. Every emperor who tried to reconcile with the West was met with riots and resistance at home. When envoys returned with offers of aid in exchange for union with the Latin Church, mobs shouted through the streets, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara." The people's hatred of Rome had grown greater than their fear of Islam. This defiance might have felt righteous, but it sealed their isolation. The Ottomans knew it, and they waited. Meanwhile, the empire's economy lay in ruins. Once a center of global trade, Constantinople now struggled to keep its ports active. Merchant fleets bypassed the city in favor of rising powers like Venice and Genoa. Ironically, the Byzantines had granted these Italian city-states lucrative trade privileges in earlier years, hoping to spark economic revival. Instead, it had turned their markets into foreign enclaves. Wealth drained outward, while Constantinople's streets sank deeper into poverty. Corruption festered. Imperial coffers could no longer pay soldiers, build ships, or maintain the formidable walls that once defended them from every threat. The empire that had once boasted thousands of trained troops now begged mercenaries for defense. Then there were the Ottomans, relentless, rising, and patient. They encroached on Byzantine territory bit by bit, swallowing cities, ports, and provinces while Constantinople watched helplessly. By the early 15th century, the empire had been reduced to little more than the city itself and a few scattered outposts. The Byzantines tried to play diplomacy like a game of chess, pitting European powers against the Ottomans, promising alliances here, threatening betrayal there. But these were the tactics of desperation, not strength. And desperation, no matter how cleverly dressed, could not mask weakness forever. In the streets of Constantinople, there was a haunting calm. Citizens moved through broken markets with whispers of prophecy on their lips. Some believed that divine intervention would come, that the Virgin Mary herself would protect the city as she had in centuries past. Others feared that the empire was cursed, that the sins of their leaders had doomed them all. Religion became both a source of hope and madness. Monks claimed visions of angels weeping over the city's gates, while others warned of judgment for betraying orthodox purity. In palaces and war rooms paranoia ruled. The Emperor Constantine XI, though brave and devout, knew he had inherited a crumbling throne. Surrounded by advisors who argued, clergy who resisted cooperation with the West, and generals who lacked soldiers, he was left to lead a ghost of an empire into battle. But what else could he do? He would not surrender. He would not beg. He would stand even if alone. The Byzantine Empire had once been a beacon of civilization, a blend of Roman law, Greek thought, and Christian faith. It had preserved knowledge through centuries of chaos, guarded the crossroads of continents, and shaped the world around it. But by 1453, its fall was not simply a military inevitability. It was a slow-motion tragedy, a collapse brought not just by outside force, but by the relentless corrosion of pride, mistrust, and division from within. The gates had not yet been breached, but the empire had already begun to die, quietly, bitterly, and irreversibly. The sky above Constantinople darkened not just with clouds, but with omens. In April of 1453, as the spring winds stirred the waters of the Bosphorus, the soldiers of Sultan Mehmed II began to arrive in waves. They were not a disorganized horde but a methodical, determined force. Over 80,000 strong, archers, cavalry, engineers, janissaries, and gunners, each man driven by the promise of glory, loot, and divine favor. They came from across the Ottoman Empire, from Anatolia to the Balkans, speaking different tongues but bound together by one mission: take Constantinople. And the empire. Rewrite history. Inside the city, the defenders numbered barely 7,000, and nearly half of them were foreign mercenaries, volunteers from Genoa, Venice, and other scattered Christian lands. Among them stood the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, whose military expertise had been begged for by Emperor Constantine XI himself. The rest were locals, blacksmiths, merchants, priests, and boys, pressed into service, sworn to defend a city whose glory they had only read about in crumbling texts. The city's walls, though massive and storied, bore the burden of time and neglect. They had been the pride of Byzantine resilience, the legendary Theodosian walls, 3 layers thick, towering over invaders for 1,000 years. But now stones were cracked, sections undermanned, and artillery was a new threat they had never faced. On April 6, the siege began. The Ottomans unfurled their red banners and unleashed their cannons, monstrous bronze machines including the infamous basilica, a cannon so massive it took 60 oxen to move and could fire a 600-pound stone over a mile. The ground trembled as it roared, launching its deadly payload against the city walls day after day. The defenders worked tirelessly to repair the breaches each night, using stone, earth, and whatever they could find. But with every hit, the walls screamed. And though they stood, they were slowly dying. Mehmed's strategy was not just brute force, it was psychological. He ordered continuous bombardments, made campfires visible from the walls at night, and sent messages promising mercy if the city surrendered. Inside Constantinople, fear grew like a sickness. Food was rationed. Prayers echoed louder in churches than the sound of bells. Children asked their mothers why the stars seemed to flicker more violently. Some citizens believed the prophecies that the city would fall when the moon turned red, and in a cruel twist of fate, a blood moon did rise during the siege. Panic swept through the streets like wildfire. Despite the crushing odds, the defenders showed a defiance that stunned their enemies. Giustiniani led a relentless counteroffensive, personally commanding troops to repel Ottoman assaults from ladders and tunnels. Constantine XI, emperor in armor, patrolled the walls daily, sword at his side, comforting the people with a calm he did not feel. He refused to hide in the palace, choosing instead to bleed beside his soldiers. The city's remaining clergy held processions through the streets, carrying icons of saints, praying for a miracle, believing divine wrath might yet be held back by faith. The Ottomans, meanwhile, turned to innovation. They dug tunnels beneath the walls in an attempt to collapse them from below. The Byzantines, desperate and resourceful, used Greek fire, primitive flamethrowers, and countermines to fight back underground. Some of the most brutal fighting of the siege happened not in daylight, but in those suffocating, dirt-filled tunnels where darkness hid the difference between death and survival. Both sides lost men in silence, never seen again by their comrades. On the water, the defenders had one advantage: the Great Chain. It stretched across the Golden Horn, preventing Ottoman ships from entering and flanking the city's weaker sea walls. For weeks it held. But then Mehmed did the unthinkable. He ordered ships to be dragged over land. Over oil-slicked logs and through hills north of Galata, dozens of Ottoman ships were pulled in a single night and relaunched into the Horn behind the chain. When dawn broke, the defenders looked out over the harbor and saw the impossible: enemy ships where no ships should be. Morale faltered. The walls might have held, but now they were surrounded by land and sea alike. Desperation deepened. The emperor sent one last plea for help to the west. But Europe was fractured by its own wars and help did not come. A few ships managed to break through the Ottoman blockade with supplies, but it was a drop in an ocean of need. Constantine's messengers were greeted with hollow sympathy and silence. The Christian world watched from afar as its ancient capital burned in slow motion. As May drew on, the siege intensified. Daily cannon fire, nightly assaults, and whispers of treason filled the air. Rumors spread that some inside the city considered opening the gates to spare their lives. Constantine had these rumors crushed, sometimes literally. The emperor gave his final orders. Anyone found speaking of surrender would be executed. This was not just war, it was the death of a civilization, and he would not let it be handed over with a whimper. On the 28th of May, a strange stillness fell. The cannon stopped. The enemy was quiet. A great silence washed over the city, broken only by wind and the soft cries of prayer. It was the calm before the storm. That night, Constantine gathered his remaining officers and clergy in the Hagia Sophia. They held one final mass. The emperor took communion beside nobles and commoners alike. He is said to have walked the sacred halls in silence afterward, asking forgiveness from God and from his people. And then, in the early hours of May 29th, the final assault began. Drums thundered. War cries shattered the silence. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers surged toward the battered walls like a tide of blackened steel. The defenders stood, exhausted and outnumbered but determined. They fought with spears, swords, even stones hurled by hand. Justiniani was gravely wounded, and his retreat demoralized the troops. The breach widened. Chaos reigned. Screams echoed through the gates. Blood soaked the ancient stones of Constantinople. By sunrise, the red banners of the crescent moon flew above the city. The Ottomans had broken through. The last defenders fell. And the Theodosian walls, once said to be impregnable, lay in ruin. The last emperor of Byzantium did not flee. When his enemies circled the city like vultures, when the gates shook with every blow from Ottoman cannons, and when hope had all but withered away, Constantine XI Palaiologos stood firm. He was not a conqueror. He was not a visionary. He was a man born into ruin, a ruler of ashes. Yet as doom approached, he did not hide behind titles or ceremony. He chose to wear his crown like a shroud and fight alongside his people in the streets where emperors once paraded in golden chariots. He had ascended to the throne in a time of desperation, when the empire was little more than the city itself and its legacy. His coronation was quiet, almost private, held in the crumbling remnants of a once mighty empire. The crown placed upon his head bore the weight of over 1,000 years of Roman and Byzantine history. And he knew, even then, that his reign would not be remembered for rebuilding the empire, but for how it would end. Still, he took up the burden, and when the hour came, he bore it with dignity few could fathom. As the siege dragged on, Constantine exhausted every possibility. He pleaded with Europe, offering alliances, begging for fleets, offering unity with the Roman Church in exchange for men and arms. He allowed Catholic masses in Orthodox churches, a move that enraged many of his subjects, but he did it not for favor but for survival. When his people cursed him, he accepted it. When his allies hesitated, he pushed forward anyway. And when supplies ran thin, he shared the hardship. He walked the streets of Constantinople, spoke to the frightened, and knelt beside the dying. His presence gave the city the illusion of strength, even as the walls crumbled around them. He could have left. Mehmed had offered him a deal, a peaceful surrender, safe passage, a governorship in the Peloponnese. It would have meant life, comfort, perhaps even some degree of dignity. Others would have taken it. But Constantine refused. He replied not with negotiation but with steel. If the empire was to die, he would die with it. Not as a fugitive, not as a puppet, but as the last Roman emperor, sword in hand. The night before the final assault, Constantine attended a final liturgy in the Hagia Sophia. The great church that had echoed with the coronations of emperors now trembled under the weight of fear. By candlelight, he took communion alongside both Catholics and Orthodox believers. There were no divisions in that moment, only the fading heartbeat of a civilization. As the Mass ended, he walked slowly through the sacred halls, touching the marble columns, whispering to the icons, offering one final apology to his ancestors. He knew what was coming. His steps were not those of a king surveying his domain, they were the steps of a man saying goodbye. When dawn came on May 29, the ground shook. The final attack began with a ferocity that turned night into chaos. Ottoman soldiers surged like a tide of death. The defenders, weary and bloodied, fought back with every breath they had left. On the walls, on the towers, in the breach, men died screaming prayers and curses alike. Amid the carnage, Constantine shed the royal robes. He dressed like a common soldier, armed himself with a sword, and took his place at the front lines. Witnesses said he fought without fear, moving from one section of the wall to another, shouting commands, rallying defenders, striking down enemies with his own hands. But the tide could not be stopped. When Giustiniani fell wounded and was carried off the battlefield, panic spread. The line collapsed. The Ottomans poured through the Kirkoporta gate, a small section of the wall left vulnerable. Chaos erupted within the city. Citizens fled to the Hagia Sophia, hoping the sanctuary would protect them. Others tried to hide in cellars or among the dead. But the city was lost. The Ottomans flooded into Constantinople like a dark sea, their battle cries drowning out the screams. Constantine knew the end had come. But even in that final moment he did not seek escape. Surrounded by a handful of loyal men, he is said to have removed his imperial insignia and shouted, "The city is fallen and I am still alive." Then he threw himself into the fray. No one knows exactly how he died. Some say he was cut down by a janissary blade. Others say he was never found at all, that his body vanished in the blood-soaked streets. Perhaps he fell in anonymity, trampled under the boots of the enemy, nameless in death. Or perhaps he became legend, a martyr swallowed by history, forever lost to the fire he chose to face. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military defeat. It was the death of an era. The great Hagia Sophia was transformed into a mosque, its crosses torn down, its icons destroyed or plastered over. Libraries were burned, palaces looted, relics shattered. The screams of the fallen echoed through the alleys for days. The last Christian empire, which had survived plagues, invasions, and centuries of chaos, was gone. And its last emperor had chosen to die rather than kneel. In the years that followed, stories of Constantine XI spread across Europe. Some whispered that he had survived, that he wandered the world in secret, waiting for the right moment to return. Others turned him into a saint, a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. Even in defeat, he became a figure of awe, an emperor who had the courage to meet death without flinching, to fight not for victory but for honor, to stand when all others would have fled. His fall marked the end of the Roman world. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had been the keeper of ancient knowledge, the bridge between East and West, the guardian of Christian civilization. With his death, the final page was written. And though his body was never found, his legacy lives in silence, in the broken stones of the Theodosian walls, in the mosaics that still shimmer in half-light, and in the memory of a man who chose to fall with his city rather than watch it be taken. There are many ways to measure the worth of a ruler, by conquest, by wealth, by fame. But Constantine XI Palaiologos is remembered for something far rarer, choosing to die with dignity when history demanded surrender. His empire fell but he did not bow. And in that choice he became immortal. The city burned. Smoke curled into the sky like the soul of an empire ascending into legend. The streets that once echoed with the footsteps of emperors and philosophers now lay silent beneath the boots of conquerors. Constantinople had fallen, not with a single blow, but through centuries of slow decay, betrayal, and forgotten glory. But the story of the Byzantine Empire is not just a tale of war and ruin. It is a story of endurance, of a civilization that stood at the crossroads of the world for over 1,000 years. It preserved the wisdom of the ancients, shaped the religion of millions, and stood as the last flame of Rome when the rest of the world fell into darkness. And in its final hours, when all hope was lost, it still chose to fight. It chose honor over surrender, legacy over survival. The fall of Constantinople did not just end an empire. It ended an era. And yet, its echoes still whisper through the pages of history, reminding us of what was and what was lost. Empires rise. Empires fall. But stories like this, live on. We hope you found this video compelling and thought-provoking. For more powerful stories from the shadows of history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.